Good morning, students. This is Aristotle's Poetics, part 11. Now we are entering into the concluding parts of the Poetics. I am Dr. Neelofer Kauri, and this is our 11th lecture on Poetics. Now, this part is related to chapter 23rd and 24. Now, Aristotle turns his attention to epic poetry, while the mimesis of tragedy is in actions told in a dramatic form. The mimesis of epic poetry is in verse told in a narrative form. So, the mimesis or the imitation of tragedy is in action rather than in narrative. Okay, told in a dramatic form, or mimesis of epic poetry. Okay, when the epic poetry imitates something, it is in verse form and told in a narrative form or a form of a story. Aristotle notes that there are a number of similarities between epic poetry and tragedy. Now, let's see what are the similarities. First, epic poetry must maintain the unity of plot. In this, it is allied with tragedy against history. So, tragedy and epic poetry can put at one place, while history on other side. History tells us that happened during a certain time period or to certain people, and as such it is often somewhat disconnected. Okay, so history is related to a particular period, to particular people, story of some king, story of some nation, etc. And it is often somewhat disconnected, because if we do not know the particular king, if we have not visited the particular place, this history will not be able to connect with the place, with the history which is being taught in the course of the history. Epic poetry should focus on one particular story that remains an organic whole. Epic poetry again is related to one particular story, and it is an organic whole. It is complete in itself. Homer is an excellent example of such an epic poet, as he tells a particular connected story in the Iliad rather than trying to narrate everything that happened during the Trojan War. So, the war's description of war, whatever happened in the Trojan War, will be the history of the war, but illustrating a particular story from that war in a particular way, in a way of a story, in a way of a narration, is the art of epic poetry. That's why maybe Homer is dear to Aristotle. Second, epic poetry must share many of the elements of tragedy. Like tragedy, it should be either simple or complex, and it should deal primarily either with the character or with suffering. Aside from spectacle and melody, the 6 parts of tragedy are all present in epic poetry, and epic poetry can also feature peripety and anagnorisis. So, epic poetry, it also shares many elements of tragedy, and it can also be either complex or simple, like the plot of tragedy. It should deal primarily either with the character or with the suffering. So the background should be a character or suffering, like in tragedy. And besides from spectacle and melody that have to be present uh, in tragedy itself, because spectacle is the overall presentation or view of the stage which the audience are going to see, that creates an effect. So it is not necessarily present in epic poetry. It should not necessarily create that atmosphere, and melody can be a part of epic poetry but not necessary. The 6 parts of tragedy are all present in epic poetry. So, and epic poetry can also feature peripety and anagnorisis. These can be a part of epic poetry as well. Now these were the similarities. First, that they both stand against history, and they are superior to history. Second, epic poetry and tragedy both can be simple or complex and can deal with the character or suffering, and can have peripety and anagnorisis. Now, there are also two notable dissimilarities between epic poetry and tragedy. The first is the length. An epic poem can reasonably last as long as a whole series of tragedies. It is not one tragedy but a series of tragedies, provided it can be presented in one hearing. So, all the tragedies presented in one go in the series of one poem. The plot of an epic poem can be far more expansive because it is not limited by the stage. On stage, Aristotle has already mentioned that we have to present the description of one day, the revolving of sun, one single revolving of earth around the sun, and it should present in that way. Means the action should not move more than 24 hours or one day. But as it epic poetry does not have any limitation of stage, it can move from more, it can expand its dimension, its limitation more. Epic poetry can jump back and forth between events happening at the same time in different places in a way that would be impossible on stage. Okay, in epic poetry, the writer has the author or the poet has the scope of moving from one place to another place in a in an instant, but on stage it is not possible to create things or to take things from one place to another place at once. So hence it is different. And second, epic poetry must be narrated in heroic meter, while tragedy is normally spoken in iambic meter. So the meters are also different. Tragedy has a heroic meter, and epic poetry has heroic meter, and tragedy contains iambic meter. So these are the differences between epic poetry and tragedy. First is the length, and second the meter. Okay, and the length can be more expandable because it is not limited by the stage, and this is not one tragedy but a series of many tragedies can be included into the epic poetry. Okay, now Aristotle is clearly an admirer of Homer's, as almost all of his examples of good epic poetry are drawn from Homer. We have been seeing this from the beginning, that Aristotle is quoting Homer again and again. He praises Homer for reducing his own voice in the narrative and letting the actions and the characters tell the story themselves. Okay, the character and the events are speaking themselves, the story is speaking themselves, and Homer does not we can do not feel that this is the you know, pain of the author that he created this. It feels that the characters and action are telling the story or narrative in themselves. Now he uses Homer to show how epic poetry can recount exaggerated events in a believable manner. When things are written in exaggeration and in an unnatural way, in a more improbable way than real life, it can be made believable. Like in stories, in supernatural stories, in anecdotes, we hear things which we do not believe, which we cannot believe, but they are made believable by the writer. This depends on the capacity of writing of the poet. A tragedy could never get away with such marvels, since they are less credible when we see them perform. Okay, when the poet is writing, things are believable. Okay, but when it is acted before us, like what happens in the movies of Rajnikant, okay, like one single man is beating more than 1,000 men, and he's throwing up motor cars and pillars, like as if he's some god. He's presented in such a way. So it is not easily believable when it is acted on the stage. But when it is told in a story, it is much more believable, and this depends on the art of the poet, that how he writes such events which can be made believable. Having said this, he remarks that no plot should ever hinge on improbable events, but praises Homer for managing through his art to make this flaw in Odyssey seem insignificant. So there may be flaws in Homer also when he writes these events, in improbable events in Odyssey, but these flaws seem insignificant to Aristotle. He also praises Homer as a master of using paralogisms. Paralogisms are the conclusions resulting from faulty or illogical arguments to make lies seem believable. So, lie is told in such a way that it seems true to the readers. So, this is again the art of the poet, and Homer was a master of using paralogism, okay, the faulty or illogical arguments, and they were made interesting and believable for the writers, for the authors, readers, and the audiences by the poet Homer. Aristotle cautions against an over-enthusiastic use of elaborate diction. While it is pleasing when there is no action to recount and no character thought to reveal, ornate diction can often obscure these more important elements when they are found together. So he cautions against being over enthusiastic and use of elaborative diction. While in using diction, if the poet is over enthusiastic, he has to be very careful. While it is pleasing when there is no action to recount and no character or thought to reveal, ornate diction can often obscure these more important elements when they are found together. So when a poet is writing and he uses these diction in such a way that it becomes unbelievable for the readers, and it becomes uninteresting, so it can make things obscure and look strange, so that would not feel good, that the readers will not feel friendly with these kind of languages used by the poet. So to maintain the quality of the epic poetry, the author has to put the events or incidents in such a way that, because there are not character or thought to reveal. In drama we have characters and we have thoughts that will reveal, that are going to reveal things before the readers, but in epic poetry we do not have the privilege of character and thought. So the writer should not mix all these things and make important elements look inferior, and things should be presented in such a way that it should be appealing for the readers. So that is this these three chapters are dedicated to epic poetry, where he praises epic poetry and he compares between epic poetry and tragedy, and Aristotle says that epic poetry and tragedy are similar on few points, dissimilar on few points, but both are better than history. So thank you sir, very much for watching. Let's meet in the next part of the Aristotle's Poetics, that is going to be the last part. So have a nice day.